This story started with a phone call to the Daily Express offices in Fleet Street. The call was taken by reporter Alan Rees. "My name's Bert," said the voice. "Are you interested in a story about a gadget that can get you cheap petrol?" Rees replied, "Sure, and I'll sell you London Bridge," but Rees decided to follow the story through. In October 1983, the newspaper's investigation team conducted a study and managed to obtain petrol for 40 pence a gallon without the knowledge of self-service garage managers. The investigators claim they obtained more than 3 gallons of petrol for £1.62. Most 4-star petrol in those days cost at least £1.80. They used a device that sent the petrol pumps haywire, slowing down the readout so more petrol was delivered than shown. It could be purchased for £95, and there were many shops that sold them. This is the story of the Great CB Radio petrol scam. Alan met Bert in the cartoonist pub near Fleet Street, and Bert agreed to fit the rig into Alan's car the next day and demonstrate its potential for £300. "I was told these things would knock out police communications and even burglar alarms, but I've not tried that," he said. It took just 30 minutes for Bert to fit the burner to Rees's Ford Sierra 1600 saloon. Bert explained how the equipment operated. You drive the car onto the forecourt alongside one of the pumps nearest to the attendant's console. Then you take the pump nozzle from its holder and wait for the operator to clear the figures on the display back to zero. Leave the pump in your tank and go back to the car and switch your set on. When you return to the pump nozzle, just keep pouring. The display on the pump slows down, and it also slows down the display on the operator's console. They went to the Isle of Dogs in East London and stopped at the Asda supermarket garage. The system worked. The investigation team further tested the fuel theft rig 4 times. On each occasion, the powerful CB signal swamped the petrol pump, and fuel flowed at full speed while the displays slowed to a crawl. The first test was at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday, October the 20th, at a Shell garage in London's Old Kent Road. Rees said, "I put the pump nozzle into my petrol tank and waited for the attendant to zero the displays. Then I went back to the car and switched on the CB set. Back at the nozzle, I got more than 3 gallons of petrol for £1.62. The next day at the Shell garage run by the Heron Group in Wick Lane in Bow, East London, I did it again. I paid £3.71 for half a tank. 2 other successful tests followed. When Rees was filling his Ford Sierra at the Shell garage in St Anne's Road, Tottenham, in North London, a motorist at another pump a few yards away shouted at the garage attendant, "What's wrong with this machine?" The burner had affected his pump too. The motorist kept complaining, and the attendant was baffled. Alan paid £3.71 for half a tank of petrol and left. After he switched off his CB unit, the other motorist's pump worked correctly. They took their findings to Scotland Yard, and an investigation was started, not before they released their findings in newspapers, of course. All of the garages were reimbursed. Not surprisingly, the motor trade, the police, and the government, which received duty and tax from the sale of petrol, were concerned. The device was a CB radio power amplifier known as a burner. They were openly sold in CB shops up and down the UK, but were illegal to use because they boosted the radio transmission power well above the legal maximum. The dodge worked because the high-powered transmissions emitted radio energy which interfered with the electronic pulses used to count the delivery of petrol at the pumps. It was against the law for a CB enthusiast to use a burner, but it was perfectly legal to sell them. The burners, which were about the size of a handbag, could be wired into a car and switched on just before the petrol was taken on. Quite simple really, although I should point out that some could output many kilowatts, and multiple alternators were fitted to keep them powered. The problem was that news of the fiddle was spreading rapidly, and by the time it became widespread knowledge, it had allegedly already cost Britain's petrol companies millions of pounds, as motorists filled their tanks for as little as 40 pence a gallon. The story was modified, as they tend to be, to the point of being almost apocryphal. The word on the street was that you could fill your tank, key the microphone which then zeroed the meter, and then put another pound in to make the pump look good. As the story began to grip the UK and Ireland, it wasn't just CB radio users that were jamming the pumps. Minicab and taxi firms were also using their in-car transceivers to slow down the counter as they took on fuel. The power amplifier used in the Express investigation into the petrol pump swindle was later given exhaustive tests in the laboratories of the petrol company. The firm's scientists were sceptical at first because their own checks on CB radio equipment over the years had proved negative, but after 24 hours, their research director gave his verdict. "I'm afraid it's bad news," he said. "It works." In the oil firm's lab test, a CB aerial was placed at the centre of a tubular steel cross, earthed to represent a car frame. Nearby was a petrol pump, and on the bench, the operator's console and a cash till. On the other side of the room, on a facing bench, the scientists had the rig wired up to a battery. In the background, an oscilloscope screen was linked to the rig. A scientist picked up the nozzle to simulate a petrol delivery, the display zeroed, and the burner rig was switched on. The effect was startling. The pump display and the operator's console display both slowed down. The pump display then stopped altogether, while the console continued to clock up very slowly. The scientist said, "We found that either it stops altogether or the pump continues normally while the console slows down. We think what is happening is that the radio frequency waves from the aerial are interrupting the pulse signals between the pump head, the display, and the operator's console. In effect, it's hitting at the very heart of the computer controlling the system." The newspaper's dossier on the swindle was sent to Scotland Yard, who launched an investigation. The petrol industry was shocked by the revelation. "Amazing," one spokesman for Shell said. "We've never heard of this. It's new to our technical people. We have no idea how widespread this fiddle may have become, or how much we may have lost. All sites build into their accounts a certain figure for handling losses, largely due to evaporation. Perhaps this is an explanation for some losses." Keith Lewis Baljet, marketing director of Heron Service Station, said, "We'll take immediate action to counter this fraud and are extremely grateful to the Express newspaper for revealing how it was done. We have had problems in our London East End operations and have been extremely puzzled about the shortfall. Up to now, we'd not been able to isolate what was causing it." BP said publicly that now the story had gained national attention, anybody would be stupid to try it. Needless to say, the scam continued, and BP launched its own investigation, passing its results to other industry leaders. Within a few days, the Department of Trade and Industry had issued a warning. They said the use of high-powered transmitters adds considerably to the risk of causing an electric spark close to the filling nozzle, and an explosion could occur in some circumstances. So, was this just the bureaucrats' way of deterring CB buffs from getting cheap petrol, or was it a genuine warning? Any radio transmission will induce voltage in a metal rod that acts as the aerial. If the transmission power is high, the range short, and the rod length tuned to the transmitted wavelength, then a significant current can be generated in the aerial. If the transmitter induced power in some part of the petrol pump, then a spark could have leapt down to earth through the filling nozzle while it was pouring petrol into the car. Heron Group in October 1983 fitted special electronic warning devices to its 88 filling stations around the country. The devices sent to Heron garages could also be bought off the shelf in most radio shops. They were sold as suppression kits. BP tested it and found it didn't seem to work well on their pumps. The devices essentially gave a warning to any radio transmission and would alert staff to motorists using the burner to slow down the pump readout. Heron also began planning a permanent solution by screening the sensitive microchip control display on their pumps with leaded glass. It wasn't just the industry that was scrambling around for a fix either. Belfast-based Robert Cunningham, who ran a microelectronics firm Microtronics, invented a device to beat the CB radio petrol pump fiddlers. By the time the story was breaking, he'd already taken 5 firm orders from city garages. The device, the size of 2 cigarette packets, sat beside the cash register and alerted the attendant if a motorist switched on a high-powered CB on the garage forecourt. He started work as soon as he saw the story on the news, and within 2 nights took his prototype to the garages. The device detected the CB radio signal and triggered an oscillator, setting off an alarm. While it couldn't specifically indicate that a pump was being fiddled, it did alert the attendant to the fact that a high-powered CB was switched on in the car. He sold the device for around £70. The following month, Ted Whitfield of Chester-based Ranger Developments produced a similar device, a handheld unit that could detect transmissions nearby and then alert the petrol station attendant. Collins Communications of Cambridge and CS Devices of Linton also developed similar devices that they sold for £51. The problem was that these devices were nothing new, and the price of existing models rose by upwards of £50 as the scam spread. Turner Brothers Asbestos at Spotland in Rochdale set up an electroconductive products section and developed a material that could be sprayed over the petrol pumps to block the radio interference that was causing the problem. Another alternative perfected by TBA was a system that housed petrol pump electronics in a special box with an RF-proof gasket. They were in touch with the major petrol companies, but I don't know how far this went. So how much of a problem was it? Stories on this were in the news for a month or so, but quickly died a death. Did these radio buffs really lose the petrol companies millions of pounds? Well, when oil companies actually checked their forecourt petrol pumps to see whether or not their accuracy was affected by CB radios and burners in cars, they found that the petrol pumps were usually safe. The main problem they encountered when testing was the damage to cash registers, which had their microchips blown by high levels of RF close by. Was this true, or just a smokescreen to deter people from trying their luck while the petrol companies raced to retrofit their pumps with RF screening? There were reports of concerns that CB radio bandits would try to disrupt supermarket till points, cash machines, and other banking equipment to try and get anything from free shopping to being able to withdraw much more money from a cash machine than they'd selected. I do know that hundreds of petrol station managers called Alan Rees to report that they'd uncovered losses in the hundreds of pounds when they spot checked a sample of garages in the London area. Swan National's Southern Forecourt manager claimed his 3 sites had been plagued by losses for 2 years in the run-up to the story breaking, up to £400 per week. That's £20,800 per year, which in those days was the equivalent of over £71,000 with today's inflation. Superficially, the idea of using a CB burner to fool a petrol pump makes sense. Any primitive logic circuit with clock control could have been upset by high-power radiation. However, you can't be sure whether radiation will make a clock run faster or slower, so blitzing a petrol pump with a CB burner could have actually cost people more money for their petrol. With a bit of bad luck, it could have also cost you your life. As I said, the real danger was the risk of a spark being produced by the use of high-power burners and large aerials, which could of course have caused a fire or even an explosion. The petrol companies and the Department of Trade and Industry were all keen to spread awareness of this risk. They also warned that people who used burners and caused interference could be jailed for up to 3 months and fined up to £1,000. Remember how I said that the story was modified to become almost apocryphal? Well, it was also claimed that mobile phones could also fool a petrol pump. There's no evidence of this, however. It wasn't until 1991 that mobile phones were banned from most petrol stations, with BP leading the way, warning that they posed a spark risk. They even went one step further, banning CB radios and even military radios on their forecourts, with all 3 technologies being identified as being within the same risk category as smoking a cigarette. Let us know in the comments below if you remember this story. Did your friend's brother's mate's uncle try it, and did it work for him?